All right. Well, thank you very much for joining. My name is Rick Walsworth. I'm Director of Product Marketing within the VCF Division here at Broadcom, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest joining us today, David Linthicum from Linthicum Research. He is, well, David, I'll let you introduce yourself. How's that?
Yeah, I mean, big cloud nerd, also an AI nerd. I've spent the last 7 years chief cloud strategy officer at Deloitte. Now I do a variety of things, including core research around how this technology works for enterprises. And it's great to be here, Rick. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. We use this theme of Mythbusters. And quite honestly, David, we're leveraging off of the blog you wrote a month or so ago around private clouds and their public value, which, I've certainly seen a huge response from this. And, what we want to do really, though, as part of this is really try to essentially take some of the common myths that are associated with private cloud and really try to bring it into really more of a modern framework. So we'll be walking through some of those capabilities, but as part of this, we have a poll within here. We are looking for your questions, right? So as those that are attending this session, we are very excited to be able to have you here, but we want to hear from you, right? We do want to hear from you in terms of what's important as we go forward. This is not going to be a product pitch. So as typically with these types of things, we throw a lot of product references in there. And while, as a product guy, I may make a few references here and there, we are not intending this to be a product pitch. This is really intended to be educational, to be informative, and use it as a way to be able to understand what are the things that are important for the folks that are attending this session live, as well as those that may be viewing it on a replay. And so part of this theme, what I want to do is really want to be able to walk through essentially what's driving this resurgence, right? We have absolutely seen a resurgence on private cloud, and I think really quite a different definition and different thinking about what private cloud is. Some of that's being driven by workload repatriation. So organizations that have gone all in on public cloud now are looking at challenges with those decisions, complexities with running workloads in the cloud, and they are actually moving that back in. So we're going to talk about workload repatriation and what are some of the drivers behind it. And obviously, the impact of AI is so top of mind for key decision makers, technologists, and those that are essentially building infrastructure. What's the impact of AI as part of this? So we're going to explore that as well. And then what we'll do is we'll shift a little bit. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about where to get started, right? Because a lot of customers that I talk to have different goals, different objectives, and they're starting at different places. So we want to have a conversation on what are some of the best practices to get started in this. And then also to be able to look at how do you extend beyond the data center. And as we define it through this session, we do want to talk about what are the requirements to be able to essentially extend that infrastructure reach beyond just the data center into edge, into public cloud. So there are opportunities where I can have a consistent infrastructure layer out across that. And we'll talk about that as we go through this. And then I want to close really with a section that looks at security and governance and cost control as part of an overall cloud strategy. And what are some of the recommendations as part of this? We will monitor Q&A, so I highly recommend that if you have questions, you use the Q&A feature within Zoom to be able to ask questions in real time. And then at the end of this, assuming we still have time, we'll actually talk through some of those questions to be able to answer your questions real time. So for any of you that have really wanted to get some one-on-one time with David Linthicum, now is your chance to be able to do exactly that. Okay, so I just want to start, Dave, with a kind of more of a discussion and this is something that we've been kind of professing, within the VMware team, going back to when Cloud Foundation first started, that really cloud is not so much a place or an architecture, it's really an operating model. And I just want to see, based on your travels and based on what you've seen, what are your experiences around this, and what are some of the insights that you can provide to the folks that are on this webcast?
Yeah, I think that's very good insights and a good way to look at the architecture. I mean, at the end of the day, no one is touching hardware every day anymore. And so whether it's in a cloud or whether it's on-prem, in an own computer system or a private cloud network, the functions are really the same in terms of how you're dealing with services that are innate to the model, native capabilities, and your ability to build and deploy systems on those platforms. And so it is a way of working, and it is an operating model at the end of the day. People look at as a certain kind of technology, and I think it's just basically the way in which we approach technology, which is becoming very consistent among the platforms these days. So I think that's an excellent observation that you guys made.
Yeah, and on top of that, if you look at how have built their infrastructure, it sounds, to those of us that have been working in software-defined infrastructure for most of our careers, it sounds very familiar, right? They take standardized x86 hardware, they build a software-defined infrastructure layer that essentially takes compute, storage, network security, and brings it under a software-defined nature. So as you say, they no longer have to touch hardware. The hardware is essentially abstracted out from the equation here, and it gives you a way to standardize a level of services that can be deployed on top of this infrastructure layer. But things like automation and orchestration come into play. So, how do you view automation as a way to be able to drive cloud infrastructure regardless of where it's deployed?
Yeah, at the end of the day, and it's kind of a funny story, Rick, when I deal with my clients who are using these types of systems, they think everything is the cloud, even though everything is not the cloud. And so
Right.
at the end of the day, we're dealing with these heterogeneous environments, but the ability to deal with complexity and heterogeneity is through automation and your
Mhm.
ability to put automation and orchestration on top of it. So here's where we're heading. We're heading into a very heterogeneous world, and certainly the AI stuff, which we're going to talk about later, is driving a lot of that. A lot of that, and it's becoming a bit of an opportunity for us within these organizations to leverage the platforms. This is very important, and it's innate to our discussion here. They're going to be optimized for the particular workloads that we're leveraging. So nowhere, it's not moving to a particular brand of platform or a type of platform. It's moving to the right platform for your layer. And people say, well, that's going to be kind of on an island unto itself. No, it's not. So our ability to have these layers of automation, layers of orchestration on top of these application data sets, AI systems, things like that, will bring all these platforms together. And you have to have that as a core capability of this technology. And so if you're moving into the enterprise space, the days of having these platforms exist as silos of automation are long gone. And so your ability to kind of span the capabilities using these larger abstract layers is really what needs to be the focus right now. And so if you're able to do that, you're able to use any number of different platforms that are going to be specific to the workloads that you're hosting. And so you're going to be able to use these things in an optimized way to meet the goals and objectives of the business. And that's typically going to be things like cost and control, which is innate to most of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other aspect of this that the cloud builders got right, man. If you look at how, AWS and Azure and GCP and all the hyperscalers, what they did is they built that software-defined layer, using kind of standardized x86 hardware as a way to get scale and as a way to drive costs down. But the other thing that they did that was very, very effective was they actually delivered a user experience, right? So if I'm a developer, if I'm a platform team that's trying to enable a team of developers to be efficient, they don't want to have to worry about the plumbing, right? All they want to do is they want to be able to go with a set of APIs, use declarative syntax to be able to build effectively infrastructure as code as part of that. But they don't want to talk to IT. They want everything in a self-service manner where I have a catalog of services that are curated based on what requirements I have for my environment. So I think this whole self-service model has really driven a new level of efficiency as part of this. And we're seeing that deployed on private cloud as well as in these public cloud infrastructures.
Yeah, the private cloud providers out there have done a very good job in replicating the best of what cloud providers, hyperscalers are able to provide. And people are looking for an ecosystem that's there as a service where you're able to get the AI configurations and capabilities or get to the analytical applications, configurations and capabilities. You're able to get, like you mentioned a minute ago, get to these core services as APIs and your ability to find how all these things are going to work, truly with infrastructure as code and with the previously mentioned orchestration. And so these capabilities are there, and your ability to provide these things within the enterprise and do so in a way where it's in a FinOps infrastructure, where it's going to have governance and security that are innate to to these kinds of systems, are going to be your measure of success. It's not necessarily going to be the specific platforms you're leveraging, but how you provide these services, the numbers of services you're able to provide, and the on-demand self-provisioning capabilities that they have that make it convenient for the folks in the organization to drive innovation, which is what you want them to do. You're trying to give them tools to create things that are going to be the innovative differentiators for the company. You don't want to limit them by having to go through very slow deployment cycles and allocating particular hardware and software resources that are there. So you have to make this stuff on demand, and that can be replicated anywhere, either within a private cloud or public cloud environment. And they basically have huge synergy between the two right now.
Yeah. And what that leads me to thinking is that, okay, so from a developer standpoint, from that platform team that's essentially building the applications that are supporting the line of business or supporting the applications that are in there, they shouldn't care whether it's deployed on-prem, at an edge location, or in a public cloud, because their experience in terms of how do I consume this infrastructure to be able to deliver the outcomes that I'm tasked to deliver as a developer, or as a development team, they should be completely abstracted from the underlying infrastructure. So they don't need to worry about it, right? It takes that off the table in terms of that. They can just focus on checking in code.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also abstracting the complexity of the heterogeneity. That's kind of key to this. And so the reasons why everybody wanted to move to in a single direction to a platform, we've been trying to do that for the last 30 years, is they're trying to get to this level of simplicity. They viewed heterogeneity as being added cost and added complexity that wasn't necessarily going to be a positive thing. We live in the day of best of breed technology, the ability to bring the right platform to the right job, to the right applications and the right data sets. And your ability to do that is going to be removing the humans and removing the developers and people who are using the systems of the underlying complexity. So it doesn't matter. And the thing is, whether your application exists on the edge or exists in a private cloud platform and a public cloud platform, or all of the above, it exists as a major agentic system or a generative AI system that uses, multiple platform layers to support the specific services that those things need to do. That should be completely invisible to people who are leveraging the system. And if you do it right, no one should have any idea what physical hardware you're running on it, because it's completely invisible to them. And that's the way it should be. They're using the resources as they need to use the resources. It's not going to be a particular platform resource, but it's going to be a resource unto itself. We're able to pick the best platform for the particular resource that they're running through governance and orchestration layers on the back-end systems. And by doing that, we're able to not only optimize the productivity that humans are able to use when they leverage these resources, and AI is able to use when it leverages these resources, but also reduce the cost significantly. Because we're able to match the right workloads and the right data sets with the right resources. They're going to return the most value back to the business, and those are typically going to be the most cost-efficient resources.
Exactly. So I think that's a great segue into our poll. So Simon, if you want to pull up the poll, we do want to, from those that are attending live, we do want to be able to have you answer these questions, and I'll read them out loud just so it's clear. But how would you describe your current cloud strategy? Based on what David and I just talked about, is it private cloud where I have all my workloads on-prem? Is it hybrid where I have some workloads on-prem and some working workloads in the public cloud? Or have you gone all in on public cloud? Our workloads run in a public cloud exclusively as part of that, or none of the above? Our organization is still a little backwards, and we haven't deployed cloud operating model yet anywhere as part of that. So very interested in your insights on this poll. We'll leave the poll up for a couple minutes, and then David and I will jump into the next topic.
So what do you think is going to be which one would you pick, Rick? I'm curious.
I mean, based on customer conversations that I have on a daily basis, hybrid, right?
Yeah.
You've got workloads that you're running on premises. You've got workloads that are running in the cloud, using traditional native cloud services. So my guess would be hybrid would be the winner, but I'm very curious to see what the audience says.
Yeah, I think by a long shot it's going to be hybrid. I'm seeing the same thing out there in the world as well. And I think,
Yeah,
that's also the smarter choice, the ability to provide the platform options that you need. And again, it gets to the discussion that we're having now, your ability to abstract complexity and deal with automation between these various systems. So it doesn't matter where these platforms occur.
exactly. So
And we're
yeah, no
right.
surprise. There's the results right there, right? So no surprise. 7% said all workloads are on-prem. 82% said hybrid cloud. So David, I think that rings along with what we said. 6% said all in on public cloud. So that one's a little surprising. I would have expected more organizations to be all in there. And then what's really surprises me is 5% said no cloud at all. They're not using any cloud at all. Although I bet you if you look deeper, that 5% would find something that's running in a public cloud, even if it's a Outlook instance that's running, somewhere on 365. But very, very interesting. I really appreciate the responses on that. So in terms of private cloud, certainly within the press and media, there's been a lot of coverage around private cloud. But I mean, David, from your standpoint, what do you see that's driving this resurgence back towards private cloud?
They're better, and they also have synergy, I think, with the existing public cloud providers. If you go back in time 10 years, when I was actually deploying private cloud systems, they were a little bit more difficult to deploy. They were engineering projects that we had to do, getting some of the open source private cloud facilities that we had up and running. And they didn't have a lot of features and functions that were native to the private cloud providers. And now here we are in 2025. The private cloud providers are every bit as good as some of the public cloud providers out there and provide very similar sets of services. They provide core turnkey ecosystems that become kind of the easy button for building analytical applications and AI applications that we're going to talk about later. And so they become the path of least resistance. And in doing so, and also they provide what I call the double C's that businesses are looking for today. And that would be cost savings and control. Your ability to have an asset that's going to return more value back to the business without sacrificing services. And so in adopting private cloud 10 years ago, you had to kind of give up on some functionality to get to this asset you're able to own, to get to the cost efficiency of these systems. Now we have cost efficiency at private cloud providers that are typically going to be cheaper than the public cloud providers out there, but you're able to get the same services and you're able to get these ecosystems and these turnkey systems. Also, you have the control mechanisms. The compliance stuff out there is going nuts right now, and your ability to have sovereign systems that are basically, locked into your particular environment, and your ability to need physical control over those systems. And that doesn't mean you're keeping the servers in the next room, but that does mean you're using managed service providers and co-location providers and, basically data centers as a service, so to speak, where you're able to rent infrastructure and rent data center space that functions like you own it, and hardware and servers that functions like you own it because you do. But these are things that are abstracted from you. So you have other teams of people who are maintaining this thing. So we got really, really good at outsourcing that stuff and the ability to leverage co-location providers and managed service providers in very effective ways, and sometimes enterprise data centers that are out there. So that's no longer a problem anymore like it was 10 years ago. But the main thing is these things are much better than they were 10 years ago. These are head and shoulders, light years away from where the technology was just a little while ago. And that's why many of them have synergy with some of the public cloud providers, which was what was missing. So if you're able to leverage something at less cost and you're not giving things up like efficiency and optimization, things like that, those are typically the directions you're going to go in. That doesn't mean every workload is going to be bent on leveraging this particular platform, but more workloads are going to be optimized on these platforms than ever before because, again, the features, the functions, the efficiencies, the cost efficiencies are there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I certainly track to that. And as well, I think, David, your definition also matches well with how NIST, right? The National Institutes for Standards and Technology views that, right? They say, regardless of where it can be deployed, it can be in a colo, it can actually be in a service provider's infrastructure. But if it's infrastructure that is provisioned for exclusive use by a single organization, that's what they define as a private cloud versus the public cloud definition, where you may have a set of shared resources that are then allocated as part of that, but essentially you are sharing resources with others as part of it, does become a definition that differentiates between private cloud and public cloud. But aside from everything that you shared, why do you think this awareness is out there now, and why does it seem to be the topic of the day? Whereas, when we were in the middle of COVID, everybody was talking about public cloud and everybody was moving their workloads off from on-prem into public cloud. And now it seems almost to be a reversal of that. Are you seeing any other indicators that might help explain that?
Yeah, the biggest one, Rick, would be the cost of it. As I wrote about in my last book, most people, when they look at how much they're paying for cloud versus how much they thought they were going to paying for cloud, it's normally 2.5 to 3 times as much. And so it becomes cost prohibitive. And of course, you could look at the shared responsibility model. They may not be leveraging these platforms as efficiently as they can. But the thing is, they're leveraging these platforms based on the objectives that were set when they first started their journey into the cloud. Also, the assumption was made that this was going to be a journey to a single destination. They were going to move to a single cloud provider, and all of their infrastructure was going to reside on that. And over the last 5 years, I think we've come to understand that that's not necessarily going to be a feasible solution. It's going to cost too much. It's going to limit the capabilities of the technology that we need to limit. We saw AI kind of reach in there and become become a larger impact and asset in that space. We got the tools and technologies to make it happen. And so we're just seeing a world where businesses are looking at the bottom line, how much stuff costs, and how much a platform is going to provide value and bring that value back to the business. And to talk about AI technologies, when you're spending 5 times the amount on building these systems and operating these platforms, that's big business. In other words, that's game-changing stuff. And so people are open-minded about the different platforms that they're leveraging. It's a very different world than it was just 5 years ago. Now people are into a heterogeneous space. They're leveraging whatever platforms are going to be the best viable and optimized options for those workloads. And that's the way it's going to be going forward. And I think that's a healthy way to look at technology.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And so, what that leads us to is kind of the next topic around repatriation. And I know this is one you've covered quite a lot in your studies, but what do you see that are, the primary workloads that people are moving off of public cloud back on-prem? And then what are some of the drivers behind it? Obviously, cost, we covered cost in a fair amount of detail. So cost is going to have a big part of that equation. But what other drivers are you seeing that are moving these workloads back from public cloud to on-premises data centers?
Yeah, I think it's efficiency and need. And so, in other words, most of the applications and data sets that are moving back from public cloud providers back to on-prem resources, back to at least an analog, they're typically not moving back to the same systems. They're moving to an analog of the system that's on a managed service provider, a co-location provider, things like that. But the big thing would be applications moving into the cloud that didn't go through any kind of modification or optimization, because they were assuming that that wasn't necessarily going to be something that they had to do. So they were lifting and shifting many applications, and I was involved in these projects as well personally, from the on-prem version into platform analogs in the cloud, getting them recompiled, getting the data sets migrated, and then hoping for the best. And that's where you ran into the inefficiencies of the cloud. Unless these systems are optimized for the native systems of the cloud, they're not going to run in a cost-efficient and optimized way, and they're not going to get the value out of leveraging that platform that they thought they would. And so they're looking at that, and then they look at the options that they have to either fix them in place, which means you're going to have to modernize the applications in place, and it just became cost prohibitive. And so, well, we can't do that, and we're spending way more money in the cloud than we thought we should spend. And we're looking for the business reasons to do that, and we can't make those happen. So we're going back and just basically putting these things back on platforms that are going to be more optimized for these systems. And typically they're going to be predictable workloads, which most enterprises are running. They know how many resources they need. They don't necessarily need the elasticity in some of these systems, even though private clouds offer elasticity. And they just see private cloud options or on-prem options as being a better fit for these workloads. And in terms of saving, $1 million during the life of the workload. And so I just think that's kind of a cautionary tale in how we do something. So we moved lots of applications to the public cloud without a lot of planning, a lot of forethought, then figured out that was the wrong move, and now we're hitting the reset button on a lot of this stuff. And that's why repatriations are kind of the, secret little operations that are going on out there. There's a war going on, and the people I think are letting on, but that's why we're also seeing an explosive growth in terms of the public cloud alternatives, including private cloud options, because people are trying to find a place to move those workloads to that are going to bring the best value back to the business. They're going to be more custom designed for the particular workloads and data sets that they're running. So it comes down to economics, but it also comes down to optimization and really just kind of making core business decisions around IT. But these are decisions with many zeros on the end. And these are decisions that could kill your business if you keep going off in these under-optimized way. And so I think a lot of courageous companies out there just made the decision that that was not necessarily the smart thing to do. We're putting it back where we found it, or putting on an analog back on another system.
Yep. No, I think that's a great observation. And I was smiling as you were kind of walking through the descriptions because, a lot of the large consulting companies and the large systems integrators, your former employee or employer probably included, they probably charged a lot of money to be able to refactor, replatform applications to move on the cloud. And then when the organization decides, oh, we need to repatriate that, bring it back on, then it's another engagement to be able to move it back in, which is interesting. But what it brings to mind for me is the inconsistencies in that infrastructure layer and the need for that replatforming, right? Because if I had a consistent infrastructure layer that I was running on-prem within my private cloud data center, at the edge, and in a public cloud, I could actually have applications that are mobile that I could essentially move between my on-premises and my cloud infrastructure boundary without having to do the replatforming or the refactoring of that application to make sure it is efficient to be able to run there.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a bit of science fiction because it doesn't work that way. I mean, the way I describe it and the way I described it to my clients, I said, you're basically taking a 1950s vintage refrigerator and plugging it into a modern house, and you're complaining about the fact that it's eating 5 times the electricity of a modern refrigerator. And we can certainly open up the back of it and enter in new components and new compressors and new parts to make it much more efficient. But the reality is that the platforms aren't designed that way. You got to remember, public cloud providers are designed to bill you for the resources that you use. And so they're very good at doing that. So if you're moving data into them, you get charged. You're moving data out of them, you get charged. You're leveraging CPU-based resources at a certain level, you're going to get charged. You have to increase the size of the memory footprint and the resources, you're going to get charged. And so inefficiency becomes kind of a boom for them because ultimately they're able to charge you for that inefficiency, just very much like the power company charges you for your 1950s refrigerator. And unfortunately, we don't live in a world where that is going to be a kind of A to A, apples to apples comparison, because you're not going to get charged for that additional resources on the own hardware systems. You already made the investment, and it doesn't cost you any more to run with additional CPUs and memory footprints on hardware that you own than it does if you work in a public cloud provider where you're paying for it as a utility service. And so people often lose sight of that. They think that there's going to be a consistent single platform pricing in these environments. And while there's different pricing tiers and ways that public cloud providers provide it, they're going to make you pay for the more resources you use. They got to do that because they have to pay for the resources that you use. Yep. So in some instances, analogs where you're going to have predictable workspaces, they're able to work in a single space that's going to cost you the same. It's going to have a fixed price over a long period of time, are going to be better deals for those types of applications.
No, great points. And let's cover that again when we talk about extending private clouds, because I think there is a way to be able to provide that mobility and provide that consistent infrastructure and operating model layer that gives you that ability to be able to move workloads between my on-prem private cloud to my public clouds. But before we do that, and this is really what I wanted to get to, because we have certainly seen a ton of conversation and decisions around AI and the impact of AI on infrastructure and where I build it. And one of the things that I've heard that just sticks with me is organizations are concerned about building yet another silo for AI. So how do you see and how do you guide customers that are dealing with this? And what's some of the guidance that you provide to customers that are looking at decisions, infrastructure decisions based on how I build out my AI and my Gen AI systems?
Yeah, it's a major decision right now, and the most common question I get is, where do I run my AI? And it's a complex answer to the question, but at the end of the day, we're having to deal with resources that are using specialized processors, GPU-based systems, many CPUs, and much memory, and lots of storage to make these things run. And also, we have a lot of data movement. Data is egressing and ingressing into these systems because we need mass amounts of training data to make it happen. So ultimately, you have to look at what platforms are going to provide you with the best capability and the best cost advantages now as well as in the future. And so that's why many people are opting not to put their AI workloads on public clouds, or at least they're doing it in an experimental way, then moving off to some of the on-prem alternatives, including private clouds, because of that need, because of that massive amount of resources consumption that has to occur. Number one, they're very predictable workloads. We know how many resources they're going to produce. We know how much inference engines impact on the processors. We know what kind of processors they need to run. And so, therefore, it's a good idea to put them in an environment that's going to be expandable and it's going to be flexible, but not necessarily get to the cost inefficiencies of operating in an environment that's going to charge you per use or usage of the resources. So these things are resource hogs. They take huge amounts of power, as you know, all the talk of building data centers and, huge amounts of resources to support these organizations. Everybody's hoarding GPU chips to run them and things like that. So keeping that in mind, people are thinking long and hard about what platforms they're going to leverage to make it happen. Now, 3 years ago, people were making the default decision, well, the cloud's going to benefit from that. Everybody's going to write in the public cloud. The public cloud's going to be the best place to run AI. And it's not a bad place to run AI. It's going to have, an ecosystem that's going to be on demand. But we're also able to replicate similar ecosystems in a private cloud option. And typically, those are going to be predictable. Those are going to be more efficient. And those are going to be running on stuff that you own. You got to remember, we're getting into AI systems. Very sensitive information is going to be on those systems. Our business data, the crown jewels, is going to be on those systems. So we have to use it to train those knowledge models. The resulting knowledge models are going to be on those systems. In many instances for businesses, it's going to be the innovative differentiator that's going to make the business. So it's in essence going to be the business. The AI system is going to define all the core processes and how you're going to run your organization, and everything is going to exist on that environment. So that has to be optimized for economics of the business. That has to be understood in the fact that we have to control it and we have to secure it, because in essence, it is us. It is the business. And so where are you going to run that? Well, that's a tough decision that many enterprises are going through right now. But I think right now, it doesn't look like the public cloud is going to be the default option. It looks like the on-premises options, including private cloud, are going to be better fits in many instances. You have to look at your particular bespoke workload to make a decision, but you also have to look at the patterns and how people are adopting this technology right now in 2025.
No, I think you're spot on there. And I've heard this a number of times is that, I've heard a CIO say, over my dead body, am I putting my intellectual property in the public cloud? Because they're very, very concerned about IP leakage. And, as you say, their crown jewels, their competitive differentiation is what they're going to use, competing against everybody else in their industry. So, they're not going to take the chance of being able to do that. So that's one of the reasons we are absolutely seeing more workloads, AI-based workloads, and specifically Gen AI workloads, and the large language models that are supporting that are absolutely running on-prem to be able to support the needs of the business there.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to be a trend that we're going to see growing over the next 3 to 5 years. And the trend is that I'm seeing now is everybody's open-minded about where to run this stuff, and typically considering cost and efficiency and control over lots of other things, including where they view the hype as being focused. And while the public cloud providers are going to be an option for some things, in many instances they're not going to have the same economic value differentiators that the on-prem environments are going to have, just because the price of hardware, the efficiency of hardware that are owned, And also, like we just talked about, your ability to consume it in kind of on-demand ways,
Yep.
where it replicates the cloud operating model, where you own where you own the system. It provides many of the best of both worlds, and I think that's why enterprises are defaulting and looking at that as the option these days. And I'm taking many enterprises through this journey. Let's figure out where we need to put this stuff. Let's look at the economic differentiators. Let's look at the optimization differentiators. Let's look at control. Let's look at governance. Let's look at ownership and also the importance of these systems. And again, CIOs and CEOs will tell me that that's going to be my business, Dave. That's going to be where my value exists. Everything that is my business is going to be in that particular model. So I need to know that that's going to run in the most efficient state based on the amount of money we have to spend this, because I'm betting everything that that thing's going to work long term, meaning 10, 20 years down the road.
Yep. And I think certainly some of the innovations that we've seen on, obviously GPU technology is getting, faster. I wouldn't say cheaper, but it's certainly getting faster and larger as part of that. And, one of the things that we've seen, much like what happened 20, 25 years ago, where I could take a CPU and I could take the memory stack and I could carve that up, virtualize that and present that. We're now able to virtualize GPU resources as well. And what's interesting is that, a few years ago, before Gen AI really started to take hold in the marketplace, people were looking at taking a single GPU resource and then carving it up, virtualizing it and carving it up so that I could have 7 users on the same physical GPU. But what's interesting now is with Gen AI, you're starting to see that turn where for these large language models, I need more horsepower than I can get out of a single A100, let's say on the NVIDIA side, where I may need to gang 4, 5, 6 of these together to be able to support these larger workloads. So I think the virtualization of the GPU technology is also helping to drive some of these innovations in the marketplace.
Yeah, and that's also a reason that the on-prem environments, private cloud environments, are able to provide many of the same capabilities in the public cloud markets. The reason we would go to a public cloud is because we have access to additional resources as we need them. We're able to provision them on demand. Well, the same trick can be done by private cloud emulations and the ability to use virtualization as access to the exact amount of resources that you need to support a particular workload. And that efficiency is going to pay dividends with AI just because of the way that inference engines work and training engines works and the way data is consumed, things like that. If you're over provisioning those resources or using too many resources, it's going to fight your economic value of the system. So you're able to provision just the amount of resources out of a pool of resources in a private cloud infrastructure. That's going to pay dividends down the line because you're able to use these resources on demand, like you would any other cloud resources. However, these resources you own, and these resources exist in your owned or rented data centers and your servers.
Yep, exactly. So we do have a couple questions. I do want to pick off. Steve asked, when enterprises do these cost comparisons, to what degree do the public cloud egress charges have on the cost when compared to MSPs or private clouds that have no egress charges?
Yeah, that's a huge differentiator. I think one of the biggest, what my clients call junk fees, that they saw from the public cloud providers, and not necessarily over criticizing those guys because there's a certainly cost overhead involved in network costs and moving massive amounts of data in and out of the cloud providers. But they didn't really understand them. They thought just a few, megabytes here, a few gigabytes here would be about all they are able to do. And now we're moving into these AI systems where they're moving petabytes, into the cloud. And sometimes they can't even do it over the network. They have to physically ship it, on a hardware device out to the cloud provider. And it costs tens of thousands of dollars just to make a single data move. And they don't understand why that's that. And so I'm seeing the cost of some of these systems that are going up to $1 million a month, and the enterprises are absolutely, going nuts about that. And the reason why is because these data egress fees and ingress fees that they're charging. And so those aren't part of owning a private cloud environment because it's your own infrastructure. So you can do data ingress or egress however you want to do it. And also you can put the systems that actually contain the data closest to the systems that are going to need the data and don't necessarily have to move things across the open internet or across some sort of a VPN, to a public cloud provider. So it's absolutely a huge thing that people are very glad to get away get away from. It's like these, the enterprise software licensing costs back in the 80s and 90s. And so they are seeing much more efficiency, but they're seeing also the less extraction of money out of the business that they can use for other purposes. Egress, ingress fees are not something that enterprises want to pay.
Yeah, and Steve asked a follow-up question, is that, all right, so when enterprise clients move to a hosted private cloud environment, what percentage of the guest OS and applications do they want managed by the MSP? 0, 10, 50, 100%? I mean, I've talked to a lot of customers. I think it depends on the
Yeah.
environment and the MSP, but any insight on that, David?
Yeah, obviously, if it's 0, I would say take a look at a colo provider because it's going to be more DIY than an MSP provider. But again, it's pick your own journey, and so the
Right.
MSPs are really kind of set up to stand in front of you and the complexity of these back-end systems to manage the hardware on your behalf and for you. And I think that's one of the reasons many people move to the public cloud providers because they didn't want to end up maintaining a data center. Well, the MSPs will do that, including backup, production, BCDR stuff, things like that. Things that are kind of overhead if you're doing it within your own data center. And so some people are going to pick the Cadillac program to go through all of those things, let the MSP do the majority of it. And some people are going to pick fewer than 20%. When you get down to 0%, say you can look at other options.
Yeah, perfect. We have a few more questions in there. We're going to save those towards the end. I do want to get through the rest of the content. So what I wanted to do now, Dave, was shift a little bit and talk about extending private cloud beyond the data center, right? And the common thinking, and again, this is one of the myths we're trying to bust right up front, is that private cloud equals on-prem. Well, for 80, maybe 85% of the deployments, that is absolutely true. They have either started on-prem or will exclusively deploy on-prem. But we are seeing a growing number of customers that want to extend that value out to edge locations where now I can have essentially a consistent infrastructure layer that runs out between my on-prem data center and my edge location, or more importantly, public cloud, where I can, and essentially, if you look at the models that we built with Amazon, right? So we have the newly announced VMware Elastic service, the EVS, that's basically deploying a VMware infrastructure on AWS. We do the same thing with Azure, Google, Oracle. So if you look at all of the major hyperscalers, there is a model that allows you to be able to take that infrastructure layer and the operational and orchestration model and essentially extend that now into a public cloud, and the ability to be able to take licenses that, let's say I purchase on premises, and now I want to be able to repurpose those licenses in one of those public cloud providers, whether it be our hyperscale partners, or if I'm running in a CSP or a managed service provider where they're essentially running the VMware stack in their environment, but then delivering it as a service. Now, even though it's edge, or even though it's public cloud, the private cloud stack in terms of the infrastructure layer, that automation and operations layer, and then kind of that consumption layer, those are consistent regardless of where it's at. So as we talked about before, Dave, as a user, as a consumer of the infrastructure, I don't care. I don't care whether it's running on-prem, whether it's running at the edge, or running within that public cloud provider. I have the ability to be able to extend that out there. So going back to the conversation we had earlier around repatriation, how does this change the game when considering the ability to be able to move workloads between on-prem, edge, and cloud environments if I have this consistent infrastructure and operational model between them?
Yeah, that's when you have hardware heterogeneity, but you're able to deal with simplicity because the same interface and the same operating model and the same operating systems and the same control plane is operating across the different platforms. And that is what people think is moving forward, need to consider as they're moving to these edge-based systems, or building things in factories, or building things in retail organizations, things like that. And if you're just setting up another platform, it becomes a silo unto itself. You have to deal with as a single platform, as a specialized platform. You're not necessarily gaining anything, but your ability to take private cloud infrastructure extended out to communicating with devices, communicating with robotic systems, things like that. Anything that runs an operating system is able to store data that becomes part of your infrastructure and is controllable within the single pane of glass and the same abstraction layer. And by the way, do the same thing if it runs on a public cloud provider, because basically a private cloud instance of that is just basically you controlling an asset out in that environment. It's all there for you. So people are saying, well, I like the simplicity of the public cloud providers. Well, you can gain the same stuff with private cloud and also extend to many different platforms that are going to be typically off limits in the public cloud world, because you're able to talk to any number of different hardware systems that need to be included as part of a platform and deal with virtualization, the ability to move applications around, things like that. So if you're moving and migrating systems from the cloud and you're repatriating systems from the cloud, using that as a platform differentiator is something that's going to be unique to private cloud providers. And I urge people to look at those capabilities and see if they can be leveraged to some sort of economical advantage as they're building these systems. It's something that you can't do when you're working in a walled garden, but it's something you can do if you're working into an owned ecosystem that you control and you're able to leverage through a single source of operations.
Yep. And so spot on there. And actually, Vivi asked a question here. In a hybrid scenario, how does VCF make it different for a day-to-day IT infrastructure operation? So I can take that one. And then the second part of the question is, any integration possible between VCF and cloud providers like Google, AWS, and Azure? So I'll take that second question first. So Vivi, yes, when looking at Cloud Foundation, effectively what we've done is we've taken that VCF stack from an infrastructure layer, an operations layer, and a consumption layer. We are now delivering that stack to run on AWS. So that's the elastic VMware service that I talked about that Amazon announced late last year that will be rolled out shortly. So I know they're very close to rolling that out. We have the same thing with Google on the Google Cloud platform. We run essentially the Google Cloud VMware engine, where it takes the VCF stack and runs it in a Google environment. But that consistency layer that David and I were just talking about exists between those environments. And then we also have integration with Azure on the Azure VMware service, AVS, which does the same thing. They've taken the VCF stack and now give you the ability to be able to run that exact same stack out in a Azure environment. Now, the benefits here is, as we've been talking about, right? I have the ability to be able to migrate workloads between my on-prem VCF instance and these without having to refactor or replatform those applications. And the additional benefit is I can actually take my license entitlements through our license portability capability. I can move license entitlements between on-prem and my cloud providers pretty much on demand. So it gives you that elastic capability, which, David, I think to the point that you brought up earlier around how do you scale these private cloud environments, obviously I can scale environments vertically or horizontally because of the fact that these are effectively just HCI building blocks that I'm using to be able to scale it out. But also now considering, what Vivi just asked relative to public cloud and running this service in a public cloud as well, using that consistent infrastructure layer, why couldn't I extend this cloud extension and use this as a way to provide additional scaling above and beyond the physical capacity that I have in my data center?
Has amazing capability that I think people should consider. And it becomes kind of a key differentiator, in terms of you just moving something to a raw owned environment or a platform that you're just driving into versus a true ecosystem and operating system that is able to provide a private cloud capabilities and extend any number of things, out to carry out what you just described, which I think is something that's duly needed right now as we're trying to scale up to these new infrastructures.
Yeah, and Yasser asked the question: does VCF will VCF continue to support multi-cloud? And yes, I mean, as we just discussed, this multi-cloud ability is really taking this consistent infrastructure and operations layer and now extending it out into public cloud providers, whether they be the hyperscalers that we just talked about, Or we also have a network of cloud service providers that essentially act as MSPs, but again, they're running that full stack. So when you work with an MSP, it now also gives you the ability to extend these services out through MSPs, rather than using hyperscalers. So you have a lot of options, a lot of considerations as part of it. So great discussion. And again, this is something that's coming up again and again. We're going to, I think, continue to see more inquiries around kind of extending that private cloud infrastructure out beyond the data center itself. Okay, last topic as we come up towards the top of the hour. Security, governance, and control. And I know we've kind of spoken about this in generalities, but David, what are your views on, some of the reasons customers are looking at private cloud as a way to address kind of security, governance of these environments, and then, certainly control. And control can be control from a cost or compliance standpoint, but it can also be just control of the infrastructure. I want the ability to be able to manage what my developers are building out across there, to curate that so that they have access only to the information that they need to do. So how does security, governance, and control play a role with making decisions about where I run workloads?
Yeah, for many of my clients, it's going to be everything. In other words, the reason that they're moving to a private cloud environment is for the security control aspects of it. Now, the great thing about private clouds now is the security that they provide within these private cloud offerings are in sync with what public cloud providers provide and other on-prem services provide. In fact, they're beyond so, because you can actually extend it out. Like we mentioned, you can include different edge systems and, even different systems that are in the cloud that are linked in with a virtual private cloud, things like that, and do so under the same security framework. Because in other words, you have the same security control plane that's able to span these different technologies. And the thing is, that's the way to make security scale, because we're not coming up with different application level and data level security solutions. There's always going to be a little of that you put in at the application, at the data, but we're coming up with a single security control plane that's able to take care of it. And the ability for a private cloud provider to offer that is going to be key to this. You got to remember, we're using this stuff in many instances to host systems that we're repatriating from the public cloud providers. And so they need the security infrastructure on top of that. And they need something that's fairly turnkey. We're able to get up and running fairly quickly without having to do a lot of re-engineering exercises with the existing systems. And also the net new systems. Talk about AI and all the fun capabilities that come along with that. You have to have a control plane that is able to operate across that. So the core thing is, we're not just solving security one time in a particular silo, but the ability to solve security many times across many applications, many different platforms, and many different systems are able to span the same security control plane. Governance and control, also the key thing. Many people select private cloud options is because of the control mechanism. It obviously, the cost is going to be a big capability, but many of my European clients and many people who are existing in the intelligence space, or even just companies out there that are getting way more paranoid, and for good reason, in terms of controlling and protecting their data, are choosing to own the hardware and choosing to control the complete platforms and how they do it. They just don't want their information commingled on a multi-tenant system, and for reasons that I think are legitimate. It's not a cross-threading of information. You're not worried about somebody picking up a server and stealing it and things like that. And in many instances, it's going to be dictated by the law of the land. In other words, this compliance standard is telling you that's what you need to do, and you're dealing with some of the healthcare related issues and finance related issues. That's going to be the case. Also, governance, final topic. At a granular level, we're able to control and put guardrails around things. So instead of just denying access to something, being some sort of an identity-based system, but your ability to allow access at certain times of day, at certain ways, certain mechanisms, under certain patterns, and under certain control categories. Things like that are incredibly handy, because we're able to not necessarily disallow people from accessing the system, but putting limitations around how they access the resources so they don't get themselves in trouble and they don't get the company in trouble. In many instances, these aren't issues with somebody being malicious. It's just people making a mistake. So I always like to proof these systems from, these sorts of mistakes occurring, and you have to have a core governance system to make it happen. And basically, to the point I made earlier, the ability to extend that governance systems out to different systems that you're controlling. So at the edge, in the cloud, all those things, single control plane.
Yep. And I mean, picking up on what we were discussing around Gen AI and some of the, security concerns, sovereign AI and sovereign cloud, certainly within Europe and other parts of the world, we are absolutely seeing a resurgence of the need for that sovereignty of data where, even though I may have a large landmass, I want to make sure that the data that I construct, the data that I use to manage my business never leaves the boundaries of that state, right? So sovereignty of that data becomes more and more important. And I think we're going to see more around sovereign AI and sovereign cloud as we go forward.
Yeah, it's going to be a big boom. I mean, reading and following, all the compliance stuff that's going on in Europe and going on in Asia Pac region, going on in Australia, and certainly going on here in the States. And it's going to be an evolving set of regulations and compliance, and many of them are going to get around you controlling these models and you controlling the data that's feeding these models, because there's a huge amount of malicious activity that can occur if those fall into the wrong hands. And I think people understand that now. The privacy concerns are there, and it's starting to get externalized into rules and regulations we have to follow.
Yep, absolutely. So I know we've been taking questions in real time. There are a couple more questions that I'll throw out there. David, so one question is, are there any performance advantages or disadvantages when leveraging a private cloud?
Yeah, obviously the key performance advantage would be you own the infrastructure, and therefore you're not using it in a multi-tenant kind of arrangement where you're not competing for CPU time and processor time. I'm sorry, processor time, memory time, and IO time on the same system. So that can be closely monitored and closely managed. Obviously, you have multiple people from your own organization, and you know who's using that system, and you know the applications that they're using. So it's much easier to plan how they're going to use and how we're going to optimize and how we're going to tune the system. So performance is going to be more consistent, more predictable, and typically is not going to be the problem it was in some of the public cloud providers where you are competing with the open internet. You have to deal with the latency of that, and also the multi-tenant slowdown characteristics and the noisy neighbor characteristics can occur in the public cloud providers.
Yep.
So that's the big one. What was the other part? There was performance and
then any advantages, any performance advantages, or are there disadvantages when using private cloud?
The only disadvantage, I could think of is if you have some sort of a network problem, coming out of the system. So when I've heard about performance problems on private cloud providers, and it hasn't been anytime recent, it's been in the past, it's always some sort of a router problem or some sort of an internal networking issue that has to be solved. So you have to have good networking infrastructure around that. So it's going to be the normal things you would have to worry about in any internal system. Sometimes if you're stretching things out into a public cloud provider, you have to worry about the connection that's occurring to the public cloud provider. Again, maybe a VPN over the open internet. Those are the only drawbacks. There's very few for private cloud providers that I'm seeing, and pretty much non-existent these days.
Mm-hmm. All right. One last question from Jeff. What are the specific security considerations that should be considered when leveraging a private cloud?
I think number one, what data are you securing, and what compliance issues are around that data as well? So how important is that data to the company? How important that data is to the compliance and the regulators? How important that data is to your customers? That's the big thing. And so you have to customize or make a bespoke security system around that particular data installation. It has to be customized exactly for the applications and for the data set you're storing. This one-size-fits-all security stuff that I hear out there doesn't work. You're going to end up spending way too much on security you don't need to spend, or you're going to spend not enough on security and end up getting breached. And so this is about requirements that feeds into the technology, that feeds into the solution.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what we see is, we see a lot of requirements for intrusion detection. And because a lot of times, as you know, right, if a malware does make its way into a system, many times it'll sit there dormant, for months before taking any action. And they count on that, right? They count on the companies not paying attention to it. But then all of a sudden you start getting lateral movement that looks outside of the norm, right? So it's that lateral movement, that east-west security challenge, it does become an issue as part of it. So, my recommendation is look for systems that have lateral security built in, right? The ability to, not only microsegment these so that you can limit any potential damage out across there, but also look for intrusions and that east-west traverse to be able to, if indeed I see it, isolate the workload, right? The ability to be able to isolate those workloads become very important, not only in the response to a potential security threat, but also to be able to make sure that you can limit it to just that area that it might have broken into as part of it. What else are you seeing, David?
Yeah, I'm seeing the same sort of thing. I mean, the talk about segmentation, I just think that has to be something that has to be considered, very carefully, certainly when you're building these private cloud infrastructures, and it's a very powerful thing to do. You can't have everybody sitting in the same segment and then not necessarily have the same sort of control and granularity around governance and security. So I think that's awesome advice. I think, ultimately those are capabilities people should look in their operating systems.
Excellent. So we are at the top of the hour. Simon, I will hand it back to you. I know we have Explore coming up. So
Yes.
if there's something you wanted to share on Explore, we can go ahead and do that now.
Yeah, we do. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, David, for a fantastic discussion here. This session is being recorded and we'll make available on YouTube. Just before everybody goes, and by the way, this is Simon Momber, just helping with the webinar today. Just want to remind you that Explore is coming again, Las Vegas in August 25th this year. It has been scheduled, and please check out the website because this one is going to be big again this year. And we're doing actually a lot more with Explore. Just the third bullet on the slide here. Explore on Tour coming for 2025. We're actually going to do more of a condensed and curated Explores London, Paris, Frankfurt, Tokyo, Sydney, and Mumbai. Dates to be announced, but please bookmark vmware.com/explore. This is going to be really sort of an event that's going to be very much focused for you, your city, your country, your region. So please keep an eye on that. And just a reminder, VMUG community and our Hands-on Labs catalog are always online. Please check out our community and become a member. Lots of benefits there. Just quick thank you again to our speakers today, Rick and David. Thank you so much for your time, your efforts. And again, this session will be recorded. Please bookmark VCF-webinars you see at the bottom of the screen for the on-demand recordings. And we've got lots more webinars coming soon. Thank you again, gentlemen, and thank you, audience. We'll talk soon. We'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.